And I just want to start by thanking all of you who are joining us for choosing to spend this hour of your lunchtime with us talking about this very important topic, one that I'm certainly very passionate about. And Caitlin and I were just discussing prior to beginning just how much we have learned from research in regards to driving and Parkinson's, how many potential opportunities are ahead in the future, and how much advocacy efforts we need. So we are really glad that you're joining us. And I would also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Jeff Holmes. So Jeff and I worked on this webinar together. Unfortunately, Jeff is unable to be with us today due to a medical emergency, but I'd like to acknowledge his contributions to this and the team and the collaboration that we have built. And just to let you know that he's also available to answer any questions after if you have any or want to contact us. And towards the end, there's a slide with our contact information. So first, we would like to thank, first and foremost, the individuals living with Parkinson's disease and their communities who have chosen to give of their time to research. We are really, we have a huge debt to them for choosing to build a legacy of knowledge and a legacy that is helping us build advocacy efforts and advance what we understand in terms of living well with Parkinson's disease today, which both Jeff and I focus on, and we're very glad that there are people who are choosing to contribute and partner with us in this way. We also would like to thank the Parkinson Society Southwestern Ontario for all their efforts, and really I think one of my favorite things about Parkinson Southwestern Ontario is that they have really made an effort to focus not only on the biomedical side of evidence and research in terms of finding a cure, which is certainly a big important aspect, but they are also focusing on how do we help and partner so that people with Parkinson's disease can live well today. And that is huge for us. And so we want to thank them also for the invitation. And we want to thank CIHR, which is the Canadian Institute of Health Research, for funding some of the aspects of the research that we are about to present. And we also want to thank all the researchers and clinicians that have advanced the science and the knowledge of driving rehabilitation. And there's a list of names that you see on the screen, both in the US, but most of them working here in Canada, who have really laid a foundation of understanding and building knowledge in this area. And we also thank them because our work has been improved by their knowledge and by their research efforts. So the way that we have outlined this talk, just to give you some orientation, is we are going to begin with 3 things we know. So what are 3 things that we have learned in terms of Parkinson's and driving? We're then going to move into 3 things we need. So what are some things that we're currently working on and things that are needed? And we have framed this in a way that would hopefully give you very practical resources. So we have things in here that you can take right away and start looking into them to support your driving and your community mobility or that of your loved one or client. And then we're going to look into the future. What are 3 things to look forward to? Where are we going with the research in this area? And what are some practical things to look forward to? So let's start with the 3 things we know. And some of these may be familiar to you, but I just want to give you some data, some information. What are things that are confirmed and that can help us in our advocacy efforts? So the first one is this, that driving is a vital component of social participation in most Western societies. Now, this may seem very obvious and evident to us because we live here and we know that in this country, Caitlin and I were just talking that if you can't drive, you really have a limited ability to participate. And that is important because we can use this information to help in our advocacy, not only for longer and safer driving time for people with Parkinson's, but also for more robust alternative transportation infrastructure. So what specifically do we know? There was a recent study just published last year that has shown us that more than half of Canadians plan to keep driving beyond 80 years of age. So that was 55% of the sample that they were surveying. And that is huge because what that is telling us is that people plan to continue to drive for as long as possible because that is the main way in which they are engaging in their activities that are meaningful to them. We have also learned that driving cessation is linked to depression, health decline, and earlier admission to long-term care. And the reason is precisely that, because in a country that highly dependent on driving for community mobility, not being able to do so, unfortunately, is still resulting in social isolation and not being able to participate. And that is a key finding that we are using in our advocacy efforts. And then third, it provides access to family, community activities and roles, services, work, and leisure. So really, driving is one of those occupations, those things that enables us to do other things that are important to us. And we want to briefly show you some of the results of a recent study. So Jeff, my colleague, led a study that was funded by CIHR that was exploring several things in the experiences of people with Parkinson's disease. And him and I just recently finished doing a secondary data analysis. We went back to this data, these interviews with people living with Parkinson's disease and their loved ones, and tried to look at the meaning that driving had for them and what are some of the representations that they associated with driving. And we found 4 main themes that we want to share with you. And some of this may resonate with you or with the people that you know. The first is how significant and meaningful driving was to them. And you can see on the screen that there's a quote from one of the participants that alluded to the fact that their car was their independence to go everywhere they went, exercise classes, visiting friends, and that losing that and having to ask someone for help which will, of course, have an impact on their independence. And so they expressed that they wanted to be able to drive for as long as they can. And this is important information to have in terms of having done the research and have it available, because that is how we are being able to generate advocacy, but also further research funding to make sure that we are putting strategies in place that can support people with PD. The second one was that people with Parkinson's disease engage in modified driving behaviors. So some of the things we learned is that there is some adaptations that people have to make. One of our participants said, I got into a construction zone. It took me an extra hour and a half. By the time I got to my son's place, I was shaking. I was too long in the car. So this is helping us understand what are some of the adaptations that people are having to make and how can we engage community mobility around those issues. The next one was factors that affected driving. And so we saw and explored sort of what are the specific things that are affecting driving. And one of the ones that came out more substantially was the stress and anxiety that driving produces, which has also taught us a very important lesson, and that is that people with Parkinson's disease have insight into the issues that they're experiencing. They know that they are having some issues with specifically complex driving situations, and that is knowledge that we can use in partnering together to make sure that we are addressing the main concerns. And then accessibility was also a concern for people. So getting in and out of the car. So often when we think about solutions like advanced assistance systems in the cars or vehicle automation, we often forget this part, and that is that even accessing the vehicle needs to be made accessible for people. And currently it is a problem for a lot of people living with Parkinson's disease. And then finally, driving cessation. So this was a concern for participants. One of them said, in the future, I don't know how I'm going to react to being housebound or being bound to a bus or a taxi, or depending on my daughter or my son to come to get me, telling me, oh, I can't make it for an hour. And really, this just speaks to the fact that we urgently need better alternative transportation options that are actually accessible, both financially, in terms of time, practically, geographically, and that we must not have alternative transportation that is limited to downtown areas in main cities. That is not sort of the way that we are going to build adequate infrastructure. So that is the first thing we learned. The second one that the literature has shown us is that Parkinson's disease does negatively impact driving performance. And sometimes I am talking to clinicians or doctors, and they actually want to know, but how exactly? What is it that causes those issues? Because then if we have that information, we can then move into developing and testing appropriate supports and interventions so that people with PD can stay on the road for a safe and as long as possible. So what specifically have we learned in regards to that? We have learned that people with PD have higher odds of on-the-road test failure, that is to fail an on-road evaluation. And they also have higher odds of having simulator crashes, that is when compared to healthy adults that are matched in terms of age. And I put in brackets here something that is very important. In the research that we've done, we've actually been able to identify the specific errors that are predictive of failing an on-road assessment in people with Parkinson's. And Dr. Sherilyn Klassen, who was here in Canada and is now back in the States, has led the efforts in really understanding what are those critical errors. And later in this presentation, hopefully you will see how we're using this information to develop interventions that target specifically those errors. And those errors are visual scanning, that is the ability to scan the environment appropriately to detect road information, but also any potential risks. Signaling, so adequately using and coordinating all the motor and cognitive functions to use signaling appropriately. Vehicle positioning, and that is basically telling us how do we position our vehicle with regards to things that are in front and behind our vehicles, such as the distance from the lead vehicle. And also speeding. And what we have observed is that people with Parkinson's disease tend to underspeed in a way that may interrupt the flow of traffic. And obviously that is a compensatory strategy to try and decrease the odds that they will encounter hazards, but that has been observed as also something that can lead to them failing an on-road assessment. The other thing we have learned is that age, disease duration, so how long a person has had the diagnosis of Parkinson's, cognitive function, and visual skills are correlated with accident incidence post-diagnosis. And what that means is that the more advanced in age, the longer the person has had PD, the lower the cognitive function and the lower the visual skills, then the higher the odds that this person may experience a vehicle collision after having the diagnosis. And then the other thing we have learned is that people with PD make more operational and tactical errors when driving. So what are those? What do we mean by that? Operational errors are those that have to do with the operation of the vehicle controls. So for example, unsteadily steering the wheel. So that is a movement that can lead to changes in your lane. You may have incursions in the incoming lane. And they also make more tactical errors. So tactical errors are related to the tactics that you need to navigate the driving environment. So things like passing another vehicle, or in this case, negotiating intersections has been shown to be problematic. So right now, I know this is sounding a little bit like, oh, okay, so what do we do about these things? But this is very important knowledge because that is how we target our intervention strategies. And we're going to talk about interventions in a minute. So then third and finally, what is the third thing we have learned from all these years of teams of people studying driving and PD? That a diagnosis of Parkinson's does not mean that a person must stop driving immediately. And this is central to our advocacy efforts. Having this evidence is what is going to allow us to advocate with the clinical community as well as with the Ministry of Transportation and other stakeholders around what truly is it that we mean by fitness to drive in people with PD, and how a diagnosis cannot be the criteria upon which fitness to drive is determined. And specifically, we have seen numerous studies from lead researchers in the field that have confirmed that many people with mild to moderate PD may continue to drive safely over several years. And Caitlin and I were just having this engaging conversation right before where her experience resonates with what we're seeing in the evidence, and that is more and more we're being able to diagnose Parkinson's disease at an earlier age. So it's becoming even more increasingly important for us to know that diagnosis does not mean impaired fitness to drive. The second thing is that age, increased severity, having had a crash experience, and lower cognitive and visual function also, they predict shorter times to driving cessation. And that basically means that people who have PD and are older, their severity is increasing, or who have a crash experience are more likely to stop driving. Now, this is key because this is how we know that preventing crash experiences in this population is key to being sure that they are going to be able to stay on the road for as long and as safe as currently possible. We also have learned that experiences of driving anxiety impact driving cessation. So people who are experiencing anxiety and increased stress during driving are more likely to stop driving. And then the other thing we know, and this it is a reality, is that as the disease progresses, persons with PD will need to transition away from driving. But that is also important information. We know it doesn't need to happen at diagnosis. It will eventually happen, but it will eventually happen for all of us. And that is changing the way we think about driving cessation. And I'm going to talk about sort of a change that we are advocating for, even in the language that we use, shifting from driving cessation to driving retirement. Can we plan ahead, all of us as a society, and can we build societies that are ready to help us transition? So if that is the situation, if that is the knowledge that we have, then what are the three things we need based on this? Well, what now then? First, we need knowledge and resources for early identification, and this specifically means driving issues. So we need to be able to early determine if someone is experiencing any issues so that we can put adequate supports in place. And I want to share with you just some practical resources that are available to you if you are a person living with PD, to your family, to any clinicians that are experiencing this, or any stakeholders that are joining us today. The first one is the Fitness to Drive screening measure. This is a measure that was developed by Dr. Sherilyn Klassen at the University of Florida, but that has been adapted, and there is a Canadian version. It is a robust measure that is used to screen for at-risk drivers. And the way that it is done is a person can access it online for free and complete a series of questions that are going to lead them to get a classification, meaning at the end of those questions, they're going to say this driver may be at risk or this driver needs the following. And the other good thing about the FTDS is that it leads to recommendations. It's going to tell you where you can go, what services you should be able to access. And again, there is a Canadian version. So it links you to Canadian services. Now, I do need to say two things. First, the Fitness to Drive screening measure has not been specifically designed for people with PD. It has been designed for older adults. So keep that in mind as you access this resource, but it certainly can help you. Even at the end, if you get to the end and you can print the result and take it to your physician or the clinician that is supporting you, or if you're a clinician or a physician, then this is something you can ask the loved one who says, you know, I'm really concerned about my spouse's or our parents driving. What can I do? How do I know if I really should be bridging this difficult conversation? And you can direct them to this resource. And the second thing that I want to mention is that it has been designed for caregiver or a proxy rater. So it is not meant for a person to complete it themselves. Now, you might be wondering why. Well, the research has shown us that we are very much unable to accurately estimate our driving abilities, you know, and this has been consistent across several populations, but we have also confirmed this for people with PD. We have seen that caregivers are better able to judge sort of what the gap or the issues around driving are. So that's just something to keep in mind. You can find the link right there. And I can certainly pass all this information to Parkinson Society Southwestern Ontario so that they have it available for you. The other resources that you can access right now is Parkinson Society of Southwestern Ontario has a documentation specific around driving, and it can be helpful information in terms of planning to retire from driving, which I really love that they have used and incorporated this language in their documentation, and then some orientation as to where to go next for testing and improving your driving. And then finally, there's other resources that are available from Parkinson Canada. Again, just planning ahead, some signs, and how to have supportive conversations. Now, we also said that we needed resources, which hopefully I have provided you with 3. And we also need knowledge. So what is some knowledge that I can leave you with that the research has shown us? And this is studies that I have been involved with. First, that risk impressions of caregivers are predictive of on-road test outcomes. This was a study, we did a secondary data analysis of a study that looked at over 100 drivers with Parkinson's disease. And it incorporated a full battery of clinical assessments and having them do an on-road test, but it also incorporated a very important part, and that was that before they went on the road, they were asked whether they thought they were going to pass or fail this on-road assessment. But also their loved one or caregiver that was with them was asked the same question, and so was their neurologist or referring medical specialist. And we then correlated and analyzed that data to see which prediction was most accurate in the actual outcome. And we saw that only the caregiver's prediction was an accurate predictor of on-road test outcomes. What does this mean for you or your loved one or your client or your patient? It means that if a caregiver, a loved one that has driven with this person lately, at least in the last 3 months, has a concern about the person's driving, that is an indication that supports may be needed and that we should be looking further into doing screening. Okay. It also means that as clinicians, we can turn to caregivers and have conversations with them about whether they have concerns. If you are someone living with Parkinson's and this is something that concerns you, you're driving, I would really like to encourage you to have positive conversations now while you're still driving. Start talking to them about how you would like them to approach this conversation if it happens. If they're starting to have concerns, how would you like them to bring those concerns to you? And what are some steps that you would like to put in place? So this is a really important conversation to have. The next thing we know is that we have a better understanding of what specific abilities to screen for that are going to give us a better picture of what's happening with that person's driving. And we have found that contrast sensitivity, so that is a visual skill that involves being able to tell an object from its sort of foreground and being able to just distinguish between things in low contrast scenarios. Visual attention, so our ability to shift our attention, do divided attention, but also be able to select specific things to focus on. And then set shifting, so being able to shift between mental rules. So for example, this would translate into things like if you're looking at a light, you need to be able to process that information, but then quickly move into the lights of the vehicle in front of you to know whether they are braking. So those skills are predictive of fitness to drive. What does this mean for the clinician? It means that if you have a loved one coming to you saying, I think I may start to be concerned about this person's driving or my loved one driving, and if you can do some visual attention, set shifting, and contrast sensitivity screening, and that is giving you some concerning results, that then you have solid evidence to suggest that assessment, a proper comprehensive driving evaluation, is pursued. And it is important to do screening. And one of the reasons, and many of you may have experienced this, and we were discussing this earlier with Caitlin, is that driving evaluations are out-of-pocket expenses in many cases. So we also want to make sure that we are suggesting that evaluations are made where we have done the sort of our duty. We have exhausted the other options, we have looked at screening, and we actually have some evidence to suggest that this is a logical next step. And the other thing that we have learned is that people with PD implement compensatory strategies when they perceive their driving ability is declining. I'm going to talk about when we look at 3 things to look forward to. There's some advocacy efforts from a group of researchers that received a large funding from CIHR specifically, and they are coming to the end of that project. But one of their advocacy efforts is looking at whether it would be a possibility in Canada to look at restricted licensing as opposed to license suspension, like an absolute suspension. And restricted licensing is something that the states it has incorporated. But basically what we know is that there's people with PD that can drive in their neighborhood. They drive only in their neighborhood. They drive only in daytime. They do not drive during the nights, or they do not drive in the 401. And that is a way in which they are self-restricting to situations that they feel comfortable in. So can we use that as part of how we move forward? So then if that is the case, and that is the knowledge and resources that we need to screen, what do we do then? So what happens when we identify those things? We need timely interventions. So I want to walk you through different stages of interventions that are available now. So the first one are behavioral and instructive approaches. So things that driving rehabilitation specialists, who are occupational therapists for the most part, can do for you. And so they can help with things like visual scanning. Sometimes even awareness of the fact that you are doing this when you're in the vehicle can help. So a very common one is in visual scanning, not turning to look when you're in an intersection. And sometimes that is done as a part of the motor symptoms that restrict range of motion, but sometimes it can also be pain management strategy. But even to know and to work with the OT to see what are some better strategies to be able to ensure the scanning. But there are other approaches, and some of you may remember this if you ever had driving instruction, but things like the tires and tarmac rule is a very efficacious behavioral approach. So the tires and tarmac rule is basically in getting into a habit of always stopping at a distance from the lead vehicles that allows you to see the tires of the vehicle in front of you, but also around a meter of road tarmac. And that basically means that you're going to have enough of a distance to react if there is a hazard in your way, if there's a sudden break in front of you, that will give you, it will buy you time. So that rule, for example, working with individuals and applying this rule is a behavioral strategy that can be very effective in managing some of the issues. The other one is the 2-second rule. So most of us have our driving automatic. We don't even think when we do these things, but sometimes all it takes is to form new habits of doing these things. So the 2-second rule is to leave yourself at least 2 seconds behind any vehicle that is directly in front of you, and approximately 4 in winter because of the conditions of the road. And how would you do that? Well, as you see on the screen, you pick a landmark. In this case, there's a sign there on the road on the left, and you see that the vehicle in front of you crosses that landmark. Then you're going to count 2 seconds, like 1001, 1002, and by the time you're done 1002 and not before, you should be crossing that same landmark. And that is telling you that you're leaving an adequate distance with the vehicle in front. So those are just examples of things that occupational therapists or driving rehab specialists can assist you with, just simple interventions. We also have low-tech interventions, so things that they can assist you or things in which you can assist your clients in looking at. Low-tech include a steering knob. So again, this, for example, I would highly recommend that you do with the assessment and supervision of a driving rehab specialist or an OT. But it can really help you when range of motion is becoming an issue and being able to control the wheel, because it really reduces the area or the surface that you're having to control, and it limits it to a very specific point. But it also locates most of your movement in the shoulder as opposed to smaller joints. We also have the Twist Assist Swivel Cushion, which is something that if someone is experiencing issues getting inside and outside of the vehicle, which can be hard, then this is a very suitable solution. You get in it, you basically just have to sit, and then you turn, then you bring your legs into the vehicle. And so it breaks it into 2 steps, but it also provides that facilitation to accessing the vehicle. A panoramic rear view mirror. So this is something that driving rehab specialists also can recommend. And as you can see in the picture, it really broadens your blind spots. So it gives you a better ability to detect vehicles that are in your blind spots as opposed to what is currently available. And that also means that it may limit the requirement of turning your head to be able to check. So you still have to do that, but you are ensured that you're getting a better view. And then another option is this standard handlebar. So if you are having a hard time lifting yourself up from the vehicle from a sitting position, there's this little bar that can be purchased. It is just, you don't have to install it, it's just portable. You just hook it into the frame of the door, and then you can lift yourself up for support. So those are some low-tech things that are available and that you can use to support you in your driving. There's also high-tech solutions, and we're going to be talking a little bit more about them, but I want to show you what they're looking like. So these are systems that we call advanced driving assistance systems, and we call them that because they assist drivers and support them in making decisions and operating the vehicle. And many of you may have seen this, many of you may have some of this. I've seen a lot of people now have, for example, the Rearview parking assistance. Um, this one specifically are some that we have chosen because they target specific errors. Remember those errors I spoke about at first. So for example, collision avoidance systems. They sense the distance from the lead vehicle. They're going to give you a warning. And then some of them can even help brake the vehicle if that is about to happen. Another option is lane change assistance. So you have some technology that alerts you. This one in the picture provides visual cue when you are about to make a lane change that the sensors in the vehicle have detected is unsafe because there's a vehicle in your blind spot. And I just want to tell you that starting in October, we are beginning a funded research project that is going to actually look at this specific technology. Can lane change assistance systems be efficacious solutions for people with Parkinson's disease when they're driving? Can they support them? Can they assist? And we're going to be looking at some simulations and whether or not this is helpful, but also what are the features that these things need to have to be helpful? Because some of them can be overwhelming. If you have it, some of you may have experienced this where you feel like, oh, if this thing doesn't turn off, like you're just so annoyed at the technology because it's really overwhelming. It starts beeping and lighting up. And so we also want to understand better what is it about it that can be helpful and what is it about it that is not helpful, perhaps for people with PD, so that we can inform some of the industry choices and designs. So we are going to be looking at that, and hopefully we'll be able to share with you next year some advances in that regard. And then what is the third thing that we need, or what now? Well, we need driving retirement plans. But in order to have that, in order for us as a society to move towards positive driving retirement, we need alternative transportation and community mobility infrastructure. And I think we could all agree that this is currently inadequate. We do not have what is necessary to ensure adequate community mobility if we stopped driving. But we are putting forth advocacy efforts, and organizations like Parkinson Southwestern Ontario is certainly moving and very strongly advocating for the needs of people with PD. And as researchers, we are hoping to even support those efforts and partner for those efforts. But we have learned that without that infrastructure, what we're seeing is that current experiences of driving cessation are often negative. And this does not need to be the case, especially if we know that people are currently outliving their safe driving ability by 7 to 10 years. And this is the general population. We are all doing this. So if driving retirement is a likely experience for most of us, regardless of whether or not we have a diagnosis, we should plan for it. And we should really be making efforts. And that is part of that advocacy strategy that is supported by evidence that we are hoping to engage in. But in the meanwhile, what are some opportunities that are available? I have listed here some resources that are available to you, like the Canadian Red Cross, Senior Care Drivers, TransCare Transportation Services, that are opportunities and options that you can access if you need alternative mobility. Again, they are far from where I hope to see them before I retire from this career, but there's certainly options that are available. And I have also included a link to a PDF, and that PDF is online. It has been prepared by the Healthline. It provides a comprehensive brochure, a scoping of alternative transportation services, including how to contact them and the fees for those that have a cost. And it includes how much it costs. And so if you ever find yourself or someone you love needing such accommodations, this is certainly a resource you can consult. So then finally moving to 3 things to look forward to. And this is, to me, always a very exciting piece of this presentation, because we are continuing this effort. So the first one is this CanDrive group that I was referring to. They are putting forth and having just initial conversations. Is there merit to think about degraduated licensing? So in, let's say, recent years, evidence had supported ministries of transportation moving towards a graduated licensing for young drivers. So if you now go to get your license, you first have to get a G1, which you get when you pass the written exam. Then you have to practice for a year with a supervised, fully licensed driver on the passenger seat. And if you pass a road test, you get a G2. Now, the G2 gives you a lot of freedom in how you do things, but it does not include, your test did not include highway driving, and it does have some restrictions on what you can do. Finally, you are required to move to the fully G licensing. So this graduated licensing in young adults has really been very efficacious in managing motor vehicle collisions in this population and helping them get the supports they need to become fully competent drivers. Now, is a similar approach to graduation, can it be used in driving retirement? So instead of the ministries imposing a full suspension, is there some merit to thinking maybe we can restrict licenses and say, you can keep your license, but we are restricting your driving to daytime driving, which means you're fine to drive during the day, you're just not allowed to drive during the night. There are states in the US that have graduated licensing where an occupational therapist or certified driving rehab specialist can actually put that restriction on your license, which can then mean that if you drive in your own community or if you drive during the day, then you can continue to drive. So there is just some initial conversations about the merits of this and looking at the evidence, but that is something certainly I think we can all be excited about in the future to see where these conversations go. The other one is vehicle automation. And you probably have seen in the news things about autonomous vehicles, but there's different levels of automation that are available today, and we can benefit from those. And one of the things that we are doing specifically is, as I mentioned, this study looking at, can this actually help? Is there merit to exploring the ways in which these technologies, and this is where I envision this going in the future. I would love to be able to produce a resource that says, based on evidence and studies we have done, to people with Parkinson's disease, these are technologies and these are the features that can help you when you purchase a vehicle to be on the road for as safe as possible. So if we could provide that information, but we need the evidence to do that, and we are thankful to be getting some supports to do that, but certainly looking for other options as we move forward. And then finally, I really love this picture. This is an autonomous vehicle that was put forth in a newspaper by the Central Power and Light Company in 1956. So in 1956, we were thinking that in a very futuristic way, this is what our lives were going to look like. And this is actually now becoming more of a reality. There are conversations that are being had by industry, researchers, stakeholders about incorporating autonomous vehicles. Now, autonomous vehicles are controversial. We have seen that there are people that love driving. Some of you hearing this conversation may look at this picture and think, no thanks. Like, I enjoy driving, it relaxes me. I like having control over my vehicle. I even have this conversation with my husband because we drive shift, and when we drive an automatic because we're borrowing a car or exchanging cars with a friend, we feel like we don't have much control of in terms of how the vehicle is responding. And we always have conversations about, oh wow, like in autonomous vehicles, we are going to lose all of that control. But there are benefits. And I think, I've engaged in conversations with industry and manufacturers, and really the possibilities are endless in terms of how this could incorporate access to community mobility for everyone. But we need to be seated at the table. And one of the things that we believe is our responsibility as researchers in the rehab sciences is to ensure that people who are experiencing and living with neurological disorders are at these tables, that their voices are being heard in terms of what they need and what they want, because we don't want this to be an afterthought, which happens with so many technologies. Industries get really excited about developing technologies, and then someone is like, oh, by the way, here it is, hope it helps, but it does not adequately meet the needs of the population. So we are working towards that. I am starting to put together a grant and try to apply for some funding to hopefully partner with organizations like Parkinson Southwestern Ontario, I would love to, and people with Parkinson's to connect with manufacturers and sit down and let's think about what this would have to look like for people with PD to actually benefit from it to its fullest potential. But that's certainly something to look forward to, and it might be closer than we think. So we really hope that this has been helpful. I know it's a lot of information, it's a big overview, but we really wanted to sort of walk you through and leave you with a sense of, this is what we've learned, this is what you can access now, and this is some things that we look forward to sharing with you in the future. So on the screen is our contact information. Please feel free to send us an email if you have any questions. And then also please don't forget to register for the next webinar that Parkinson's Society of Southwestern Ontario is organizing on understanding regenerative medicine approaches to treat Parkinson's. And that is going to happen on October 24th at the same time, and that's a link to register. And I have left some time for questions. So if you have any questions, I would love to answer them, and I will pass it on to Caitlin.